discussing hemodynamic assessment and fluid management is a major challenge. It's a large area to talk about. So I want to basically use 4 straightforward questions to talk about this. The first one seems rather straightforward, seems rather easy. So which hemodynamic parameters do we need to monitor? So the cardiovascular system is actually very complex, and we know that from our daily business in theatre. Watching our patients, different pathologies interacting what we do every day. So looking at the cardiovascular system, we're looking at the Starling curve, we're looking at the venous return curve, and both are interacting. On top of that, we're looking at a pulmonary and a general circulation to make it even more complex. And the heart, of course, 4 different chambers, 4 different areas where pressure is different. And of course, we have the interaction of the cardiovascular system with the lungs. Then again, in theatre, we also use positional changes, also offsetting all these systems, altering the interactions and making it more complex. And ultimately, of course, the heart is connected from the right to the left side and back again with arteries and veins. And they are also changing all the time with the drugs we use. They vary between patients based on their comorbidities. So all in all, a very complex system. So how do we go about? So I suggest that we actually look at the actions we have in our arsenal. We want to assess whether the patient is normovolemic or whether we need to add fluid. Are they hypo or hypervolemic even? Do we need to give diuretics? Or are they vasoplegic? Do we need to give a constrictor? And in the end, of course, we need to assess whether we need to support the heart and increase the contractility. These are the basic questions we're confronted with every day. And there are a lot of tools out there that can support us doing this. So again, we can look at about everything, and we can make it as complicated as we want, adding ultrasound to this and to the other measurements we already have. So going through the list of things we have available, let's start off with the things we measure every day. Static filling pressures, central venous pressure, mean arterial pressure. They actually show no correlation whatsoever to the Starling curve. So can we use them as trend? Can we monitor them and see whether the patient is moving in one way or another? Actually, another thing that we don't know. Looking at dynamic parameters, they've got a lot of attention over the last decade. PPV and SVV, pulse pressure variation, and stroke volume variation. That's looking at the interaction of the lungs with the cardiovascular system. And they have some limitations as well. They look promising, but we don't use them in spontaneous breathing patients. And of course, tidal volume needs to be sufficient to actually assess them. And again, other situations that occur in theatre quite often, like abdominal pressures during laparoscopy or open chest conditions, they all influence the quality and the accuracy of these parameters. So can we use challenges? A passive lag raising challenge or a PEEP challenge? It all very much is based on whether we can do that actually in theatre. Is it allowed by the surgeon to do it? So again, more difficulty, more complexity in our face. So looking at cardiac output monitoring and fluid loading responsiveness. So fluid loading responsiveness is basically assessing whether we can give more preload, give fluid, and it will actually benefit your patient. So predicting that response by the patient, ultimately to decrease the number or the amount of fluid we're giving rather, we look at cardiac output with this receiver operating curve. We can actually see it's a rather mixed bag. And although it looks promising, it's in the upper quartile, sensitivity is high, specificity is high, it's still not where we want it to be. So just looking at fluids, can we use baseline measurement of cardiac output? Absolute values are not that reliable. So again, looking at a more dynamic approach, can we use a fluid challenge? And I guess most people will do that every day. Can can we use a fluid challenge and look at changes in the cardiovascular system to see whether we need to fluid load our patient? So we looked into that with a couple of patients, 21 to be exact, after CABG or valve surgery. And we found that if you give a 200 ml fluid bolus, you can actually identify the responder from the non-responder. It actually is very accurate at predicting whether you need to give more fluid, give the rest of the bag, and supplement to 500 mils. So this looks rather promising. Another thing we can do is one of those challenges is the passive leg raising. You raise the legs by 30 or 45 degrees, and you basically give an autotransfusion. It's reversible, so that's very charming. And like you see, the delta cardiac output is rather predictive of fluid loading responsiveness. So this is a tool that we want to use. Although, I guess, if we use it in theater, some surgeons will start complaining, and I guess this is more valuable to the ICU physician than it will be to the anesthetist. So looking more in depth into this fluid loading responsiveness concept, this meta-analysis summarizes these findings. If you lump all of the literature together, we find that pulse pressure variation, given the limitations of the ventilator settings, spontaneous breathing, etc., is rather reliable in predicting fluid loading responsiveness. And passive leg raising has actually more accuracy to give us. So it is a valuable tool, but again, more an ICU tool than a theater tool. So trying to boil it down to the bare essentials, if you ask me to what would you want to watch in theater, what would you try to assess, it's looking at preload. Do I need to give fluids or not, or diuretics for that matter? So how is contractility, and do I need to give inotropes for that? And you want to look at afterload. So these are the three concepts you really want to look at, the three items you really want to assess. And there are a couple of tools that you can use. But ultimately, it's all about delivering oxygen to the tissues. And Shoemaker, a while back, showed us quite clearly that if we want to make a difference in the operating room, it's about identifying the patient that is developing a deficit and turning it around. He found that if people develop a oxygen deficit and you don't reverse it in time, they're actually prone to get complications, or they even die in hospital. So it's all about delivering oxygen to the tissue. And if you look at the formula we've all learned a while back in medical school, at least for me that is, you have to look at the amount of erythrocytes that are circulating and keep HB at a certain level, give enough oxygen, but ultimately it's all about delivering the oxygen, so flow. So for this question, what parameters do I need to look at to assess hemodynamics? It's basically that it is very complex to assess hemodynamics, and that every technique and every parameter for that matter is actually something that has contraindications and indications. That adds to the complexity of intervening and assessing. So assess preload, afterload, and contractility to ultimately optimize organ perfusion. I think that's the bottom line here. So let's go on and talk about fluid management and morbidity. The effect of hypervolemia, as we all know, is that we increase the chances of death. We basically increase all kinds of nasty things occurring after surgery. And again, I have to stress here, there is a time interval between our interventions and the complications occurring. But hypervolemia in theater will lead to some nasty things happening after the patient leaves. ICU length of stay can be increased, and hospital stay can be increased as well. So now, referring to a trial that's been performed by Judy Thacker and Monty Mython, that clearly shows this relationship where you want to achieve hypo, or basically achieve normal volemia, and want to avoid hypo or hypervolemia. So in tens of thousands of colonic surgery patients, they looked at three categories. For this same type of surgery, patients either get between 0 and 1.5 liters of fluid balance, and correct me if I'm wrong, Monty, between 1.5 or 3 and up. And you could see that there is a clear correlation between the fluid balance in theater and the chance of staying longer in hospital, and all kinds of other complications. I just took ileus here, but there are a couple of other complications that have the same relationship. And this U-shape is actually a confirmation of something that was posted or formulated earlier, that we're looking for this optimum. We're looking for an optimum in every patient. Normal volemia, that's something we need to achieve. If you give too little fluids, you will get a lot of complications. And even more so if you go more liberal and achieve hypervolemia in your patient. And complicating this is that every patient is different, which means that that this normal volemia, this optimal point, is probably different for every patient. So again, referring to this Lillo paper, something that was carried out in the US in California, you could see that for different types of surgery, looking at the amount of fluid that was given for this exact same type of patient by different care providers on different days, there is a lot of standard deviation. There's a lot of variance between practices, even within the same care provider. So one day you could give a zero fluid balance or achieve that, and later on the next case you would give a lot more. And it's this variance that for me basically shows that, and this graph shows it even more, that there's a lot of variance going on, that there's a lot to gain. So I think variance is a signal that we can optimize more. So over time, in the last decades, we've seen a move from liberal fluid management in the 1980s to more restrictive fluid regimens thereafter, to a time where we were assessing fluid responsiveness, and I think the 250 or more papers that are out there are evidence of that. And then we moved on to gold record therapy with more than 50 trials and a large number of meta-analyses out there at the moment. So gold record therapy is a way of achieving certain goals. Mostly cardiac output based targets are in place, and fluid is optimized, or cardiac output rather is optimized with the use of fluids and sometimes inotropes. And Pierce showed rather well that gold record therapy in itself and having a protocol like that is very good at achieving a higher oxygen delivery. I also already referred to the meta-analysis that were or are available out there. The one by Pierce is probably stuck to mind most people, and it showed that if you stack all these trials together, there's a big impact if we look at a target, predominantly cardiac output, and optimize it in achieving less complications in our high-risk surgical cases. Now, some will say that enhanced recovery after surgery in itself is what makes the difference, and it's not fluid therapy on its own. Well, you see here that without the ERAS context, you can see that fluid or gold-record fluid therapy achieves at reducing complications. And although less significant, it still adds to the outcome and within ERAS if you discern it from that setting. So for me, GDFT, or GDT rather, is an integral part of the ERAS approach, to the enhanced recovery after surgery approach. GDFT allows us to reduce the number of, or the size of the variability that we see out there. And there's a high impact for high-risk surgical cases. I just want to touch upon an issue that I think doesn't receive enough attention, and that is the amount of fluid our patients are getting in the ward. If you look at these trials, none of them actually discuss what the standard is for their post-surgical care in the ward, which I think in itself is an interesting finding. And actually, for our own institution, I don't know what we're doing in the ward. But I think looking at variability in theater, it can be random chaos out there as well. So moving on to the third question, what are the high-risk patients? Assuming that I want to institute gold record therapy for my patients, who do I target? And how do we assess this risk? Now this is, again, a question that varies and is based on the setting. So if we look at this trial by peers that assessed in-hospital mortality, we can see that there are a couple of indicators of risk. Emergency surgery, of course, very high-risk surgery. Abdominal surgery in general, there is higher mortality for that group. And the list goes on, and I think we basically know what they are, which operations provide the major risks for postoperative mortality and morbidity. So then looking at it in more detail, and I think Boyd quite eloquently stated that high risk also depends on your own setting. The cost of advanced monitoring and implementing it, there's a trade-off, and you need to for every hospital it's basically different. And it also depends on the complexity of your own case mix. But in the end, it's duration of surgery, potential blood loss, the approach, so open or laparoscopy, location of surgery. Most of the times if you open a body cavity, there's a higher risk involved. And of course, your own local practice is important too. So moving on to risk scores. Are there any risk scores that I can use to assess these risks and basically have an easy tool to assess who do I need to target? Now looking at all of these scores, and this is just a limited number that I displayed here, is that there are a lot out there, and most of them look at 1, 2, or 3 components. But ultimately, not all of them do rather well, or most of them actually don't assess risk to the point that we want. ASA score, I think everyone knows and sees it every day that it's not a proper assessment of risk and stratification of risk for the postoperative setting. So I want to look at this last risk score that I mentioned, the POSPOM. It was published rather recently, and the POSPOM is basically a big data approach to acquiring a good risk score. And the objective was to assess risk from only preoperative information, basically what we do in everyday practice. So what did they do? They targeted adult patients undergoing surgery under anesthesia, any form. They built the score with the use of more than 2 million cases in France, and they validated again on a similar group. So it's building the score and validation in one. And they looked at 3 components: age, comorbidities, and the type of surgery in itself. Now, first results were really, really good. And as you see here, so this is basically shows you the stratification. So the line is the risk, and the scores are displayed with the bars. And actually, as you see, risk rather goes up really well, and it corresponds really good with the scores. So we have potentially a very good score here. So if you look at what it ultimately come up with, they have 17 age groups, age brackets that they use to stratify risk, and then they look at patient comorbidities. 15 comorbidities listed here, all with their own added risk profile. And then they displayed 25, I think it was, types of surgery. Now, of course, this list for some surgeries is less practical. So if you do use of ejectomies, you actually are in the body, both in the abdomen and in the thorax fiddling around. So that means probably risk is higher than you can actually assess here. So my take-home message here is high risk is a trade-off between the patient, both age and comorbidities, and the type of surgery that they're going to perform. Monitoring level that you want to institute and basically adapt to this risk is a trade-off between that risk, your local practice, and your financial setup. Again, a limitation, I think, that the last bit. Scores can help to assess that risk. But good scores are rare. And post-BOM gives us a good possibility there. Although I think we're not quite there yet, because physiology, acute problems are not in there.